First story I mentioned there, though, the UK's highest court ruling that families and doctors can agree to end the life-sustaining care of patients in a persistent vegetative state without legal permission. It's the Supreme Court, of course. They ruled yesterday a hospital can withdraw treatment when patients have prolonged disorder of consciousness, such as a minimally conscious or persistent vegetative state, if families and medical staff agree. If families and the medical team were in dispute, as in recent cases, of course I don't need to remind you, I'm sure, cases such as Charlie Gard and then there was Alfie Evans, that decision would still therefore be referred to a judge. This follows the case of a man who's known only as Mr. Y, a financial analyst who suffered extensive brain damage caused by lack of oxygen during a cardiac arrest. Sadly, he was never to regain consciousness. He required artificial nutrition and hydration. He since died at the age of just 52. Now, his doctor concluded that even if he'd regained consciousness, he would have had profound disability and been dependent on others throughout the rest of his life. But a second specialist considered Mr. Y to be in a vegetative state without prospect of improvement. Mrs. Y and the couple's children believed he would not wish to be kept alive given that prognosis. They agreed with the clinical team that it would be in Mr. Y's best interests for treatment to be withdrawn, which would result in his death. Last November, the NHS trust involved sought and was granted a declaration from the High Court that it was not mandatory to seek the court's approval for withdrawal of treatment. A lot of words and a lot of legal precedent and legality there, but it is simply, is it right that a family can switch off dad or mum or whatever it might be? Let's speak first to Dr. Anthony McCarthy, who's a board member of Care Not Killing. I know your organisation has considerable concerns. Doctor, what are they? Good morning.
Well, this is really a removal of a protection to a group of very vulnerable people. What we're talking about is deliberate dehydration to death of certain people in these states, states where they are, in fact, awake and have some level of awareness in many cases. And for that not to be a subject of judicial oversight is very alarming.
What in this instance, though, where it would appear the family were in accord with the medical experts, why prolong Mr. Y's agony?
Well, people in these states are not generally in agony, given that the state that they're in. They're not imminently dying, so they're not imminently dying. They're not...
they do have no quality of life. I think it's fair to say that, isn't it?
Well, their life has a value, and it's a continuing life. People also, we do know, have recovered from some of these states. In fact, thanks to the Court of Protection, some people are alive who have told us that they are very, very grateful for this to have happened, and we know this from locked-in syndrome cases also. So it's very, very alarming if a family and a doctor can classify as in someone's best interests them being dehydrated to death, because that's what's happening. You are deliberately ending somebody's life who is not imminently dying from any other condition, and you're saying, this doesn't need any judicial oversight. These prognoses are highly contestable. We've seen Professor Stephen Sternham present a lot of evidence on this. So it's really bad medicine and bad ethical practice.
Stay on the line if you would, Doctor. I want to bring someone else into the conversation. Davina Hare is the Director of Policy for Dignity and Dying. As you've heard it outlined by my other contributor, how can you possibly support this? Morning.
Good morning. Well, I think the vast majority of people would support what the court has said, because nobody's saying that these decisions are easy. Obviously, it's incredibly difficult for families to, watch their loved one over a process probably of years, in this situation where they're in a persistent vegetative state or a minimally conscious state. But what the court's decision is doing is trying to make care of these patients more truly person-centred by saying, if the doctors who are providing the sort of medical opinions agree that there's no prospect of recovery, if the family all agree that it would be what the patient would have wanted to have their treatment discontinued, and only when there is complete agreement on that, then the treatment can be withdrawn.
Yes, but in the case that my other contributor talked about, such as locked-in syndrome, the person who's in the hospital bed or wherever it might be has no input, and in fact they might come round, for want of a better expression.
I think we have to be clear that the court is talking about cases where it's very, very clear that somebody is going to recover, or certainly not recover to an extent that could be considered meaningful. It's not a decision that can be taken lightly. There needs to be a lot of medical evidence, and if there's any disagreement, the case goes back to court for a decision.
Yes, but we might contribute. Well, let's just clarify. Doctor, I think you say you've spoken with people who effectively, and I'm sorry to use this term, but were effectively written off, but they have returned.
Well, we need to distinguish, but yes, there are people who have been in minimally conscious states, and the Court of Protection has actually helped these people. One can find all sorts of evidence. As I say, Professor Sternham, you can also talk about people whose condition improves. It doesn't mean that they're, walking and talking and in a great state. But certainly there are cases we know of, and the court was presented with cases relating to minimally conscious state, where it's very important that the Court of Protection had that. And I think the general point is, is being dehydrated to death, that's what we're talking about, is that in a genuine patient's best interest? The real worry is, if a patient is seen as burdensome on doctors and families, we have to be realistic about this, are those the things that are driving the decisions about care? Or is it simply that people have a right to food and drink in these states, which again, as I say, are not terminal, they're not dying from these states, they will die because their hydration is stopped.
Yes. That's a pretty grim way to go, back to you, Davina Hare, isn't it, to be dehydrated to death, to use the doctor's words?
Obviously, it's not really a death that people aspire to, but,
goodness me, I think that's fair,
for these cases, what is the alternative? It's somebody spending years, suffering, being fed and watered through a tube, but they're not capable of eating. Medical technology has changed so much that we can keep these people alive for years, maybe even decades, but that isn't necessarily what they would have wanted. And in the cases that have come to court, it's very clear that the family are only motivated by what they think their loved one would have wanted, and for many people, quite frankly, that won't be to live in a state where they aren't aware, cannot communicate, are simply being fed by tube.
Davina Hare, thank you. You're Director of Policy for Dignity in Dying. My thanks also to Dr. Anthony McCarthy, who's a board member for the campaign Care Not Killing.